Color management can often be quite a daunting and technical subject for a lot of beginner and even intermediate photographers. So today I'd like to discuss a few easy and simple steps that you can take that will vastly improve the colors of your images. Now today specifically, I'll be talking about Canon cameras as that's what I use, but a lot of the concepts will be broadly applicable across any brand of camera that you use here in Lightroom. I brought up a few examples here which we'll go through in just a moment, but first I would like to discuss the impact of color spaces. So a color space can be broadly defined as a boundary of colors within which a monitor can display or the human eye can see. So the horseshoe shape, which we see here, is broadly the range of colors that the human eye can see. That's the visible spectrum. And within that, we have a few commonly used color spaces: sRGB, Adobe RGB, and Pro Photo. CMYK is also quite common, and that fits even smaller within sRGB. The tendency might be to say, well, using the largest possible color space is going to be best. However, as we can see with Pro Photo, some of those colors are actually outside of the visible spectrum. So you won't be able to see those colors even if they were present in your images. Further down the list we go. Adobe RGB is potentially a good option as it's broader than sRGB, so you get more colors, especially in those greens and cyans. However, most of the monitors that we use don't actually cover this spectrum either. So for the most part, my recommendation would be to work in sRGB given the option. Unless you have an expensive Adobe RGB calibrated monitor, then sRGB is going to be the best bet. sRGB is of course the widely accepted color space that's used across the whole internet, and many printers and print papers will only offer a gamut of colors that fits within sRGB anyway. So widely speaking, sRGB is going to offer plenty wide enough of a color space within the context of landscape photography. So that all being said, when you import your raw files into Lightroom, they won't have a color space assigned to them. Lightroom automatically uses its own custom color space, and so the options that we'll have if we open up one of my raw files here is in the profile section here in the treatment panel of the develop module. The single biggest tip that I can give is to set the camera profile, especially for Canon CR3 RAW files. To show you how this image would look using the standard Adobe color profile, we can see how yellow and almost washed out this result is. Jumping back and forth, we can see how the camera faithful profile there has brought a lot of richness and color separation. It's especially evident in the histogram here. We can see the color separation between the reds and blues. Applying the Adobe color brings those reds and blues closer together. So I quite like that almost split-toned effect where you have blues in the shadows and warm highlights. So in order to set this profile, we go into Browse and down into the camera matching section. And Canon has provided Adobe with a series of different profiles that you can apply to your image. So I tend to go with either faithful, neutral, standard, or landscape, depending on the image and the scene. I can also show you a before and after, and you can see how much vibrancy and richness that just simply applying that profile has brought. We can see I haven't bumped up the vibrance or saturation, and I haven't changed anything in the HSL sliders. So that is almost entirely coming from setting this profile to the appropriate camera faithful or whatever your choice is for that image. The second tip that I can give is setting a neutral white balance. So for me, in my experience, Canon cameras is going to be 5500 and around about the +14 range on the green magenta slider. If I were to say bump this up to 6000, which is what this image was brought in at, we can see that the whole image goes a lot warmer, and actually we've lost a lot of color separation. Toggling back to 5500 here, we can see that the tops of these mud cracks are looking a lot more neutral, and against the very rich oranges of the cracks themselves, it's providing a lovely color separation and contrast there. Now the same is true with the second example here. You can see I have set it to camera faithful, and if we go to the Adobe Color, the same is true again, where the image feels a little bit washed out, a little bit lacking in saturation and vibrance. And I think that the camera faithful does a much better job here of interpreting the raw color information. Again, I've set this to 5500, and you'll see that in this case I've actually reduced the saturation because I've added a fair amount of contrast using the curves slider here. So those are two examples using very vivid reds, which is often a color channel which clips quite easily. And it's no different when you get into more traditional, wider landscape scenes like this from up in Scotland. In this case, I've gone with the camera landscape to bring a lot of richness and vibrancy to the scene. If I go and scroll through a few of the different options, you can see faithful's looking a little bit flat to my eye. Neutral's a little bit maybe magenta or purple. Standard's looking quite good, but it's sort of lacking in saturation. And the landscape's quite contrasty, but I think I like the sort of almost Velvia interpretation of this particular scene. And again, setting that white balance to a neutral white balance really helps to bring out the blues and reds up in the sky. It might be for this particular scene that I'd like a slightly warmer overall image, so I could set that to 6000 to really try and bring out the sky, the color in the sky. But I think it starts to bring in a slightly awkward hue into the foreground shadow, which really should be more of that cold blue, I think. The other thing that we can do is shift some of the hues of the sky colors. So if we just toggle this on and off, you can see the raw files sort of interpreting it as quite peachy yellow. And my memory of that morning is that rosy pink sunrise. So I have gone in and shifted some of these hues slightly. And overall, I've played a little bit with some of these magenta and purple saturations. I found them just a little bit too crazy here in the shadows of the mountains there. Comparing the camera landscape profile and that neutral white point with the Adobe color interpretation and a slightly warmer white balance, we can see how much more vibrant and rich the colors are when we use the correct profile and set a neutral white point. So those are some really quick, easy steps to take to vastly improve the colors that you're going to get out of your Canon cameras. And of course, the same tips apply across any camera brand here in Adobe Lightroom. So color spaces become important when you start to export out of Lightroom. And in order to make sure that you're doing that correctly, we go over to the Lightroom settings tab and the external editing. And here we can see when you are going to edit in Photoshop, what is the color space that the file is going to be set at. If we come down to color space, we can select sRGB, which would be the my recommendation for what to set, especially when you are exporting into Photoshop. This way, your display is going to be able to correctly show you the colors, and when you go to say print that or display it on the web, then your colors won't shift. If you do happen to have an Adobe RGB calibrated monitor, then of course you could set this to Adobe RGB. And the latest MacBook XDR displays do display up to about 96-97% of the Adobe RGB gamut. So it might be something to consider if you've got one of these advanced displays. That's what I currently set my workflow to. But of course, when I go to export a file, especially for web display, it's important that when we're in the export menu, the file settings, we set here this color space to sRGB. If you set this to Adobe RGB and then you post that to Instagram, for instance, Instagram is going to shift those colors and you'll notice a difference between the file that you uploaded and the file that's displayed on your social media or website or wherever that is. So that's a few quick tips to get better results out of your color images in Lightroom. Thank you so much for watching. Please do comment, like the video, and subscribe to the Pickfair YouTube channel. Cheers, see you in the next one.